Hey everyone, Nick here and welcome back to GamerTube, and welcome back to our Poppy Playtime character concept series. So in today's video, the character looking into is Putty. So we're going to this character's location, gameplay mechanics, backstory, and all that good stuff as well. Now as always, I will just state that this isn't necessarily into the overall universe and lore of Poppy Playtime. This is just a fun what if scenario and a creepy story we get to tell, and we hope you enjoy. And lastly, before we start today's video, do be sure to subscribe to GamerTube as it helps out a lot and it's greatly appreciated. It also keeps you up to date with all the videos that we post. Alrighty, well, let's get into the character concept of Putty. So previously in our Poppy Playtime character concept series, we've been following our main protagonists as they make their way through the Playtime Co factory and try to find a way out. Whilst doing so, they've encountered a number of dangerous toy characters that are out to harm them. And the next toy they'll meet is no exception. So as our main protagonist wanders through the halls of the Playtime Co factory, they notice something quite strange. On all the walls seems to be a strange green liquid. It was more of a slime than anything else. It slowly dripped down the walls in a gross and off-putting way. It's probably best they don't touch it. As they continue forward, they come to a new area of the factory. This part of the factory was called the Putty production area. Putty? Why does that sound familiar to them? They've heard of that before. Regardless, they look around this new area and search for a way out of here. As they walk around, they hear something crunch under their feet. It was a small metal tin. They were scattered all over the floor. All of them seemed to be empty. The tin read, Playtime Co. Play Putty. Play Putty, of course. It was all coming back to them now. They remembered Playtime Co. developing this special kind of putty when they used to work here. Back in the day, slime and putty were all the rage. Many companies were making their own ooey gooey putties and selling them like hotcakes. But Playtime Co. being Playtime Co., they needed to make something that was new and different. And the product that they came up with was Play Putty. Play Putty was different from everything else on the market. The way in which it differed was that it could move on its own. It wasn't necessarily alive and sentient, but it wasn't not alive either. The putty would move around all by itself and make different shapes and objects. No one had ever seen anything like it at all. Children who owned Play Putty needed to add the special included magic powder to keep it moving. Without the powder, it would just lay dormant. The powder was just simply proteins that the putty would feed on. But the workers at the factory would soon find out that the putty needed a larger protein source to survive. So, no one knew what made Play Putty so special. It was a Playtime Co. secret. But unfortunately, the main protagonist knew that awful secret. So, as we all know, all the toy characters at Playtime Co. have been infused with the souls of the orphans and other Playtime personnel. In the last chapter, we see that the factory was testing the orphans for a number of games. It was to see if they were eligible to have their souls infused with the toys. But what about the children that didn't do so well in those games? Well, Playtime Co. still had a use for the orphans that got below average scores. Considering that Play Putty didn't require higher intelligence, and it only needed to move and mould itself, they would instead fuse these below average orphan souls with large vats of the putty. They would then package it and sell this magical Play Putty to children all over the country. But unfortunately, things went south at the putty production area. Every tin opened up by itself and fused into a large mass of putty. This massive glob of slime grew incredibly harder to deal with day by day. Along with the large size, they also grew a large appetite as well. The Play Putty started feasting on the workers. Once they were inside of their gelatinous body, there was no escape. The Play Putty would slowly dissolve them as it feasted on their nutrients. The workers developed a weapon that they could use to keep the slimy beast at bay. But unfortunately, it ate everyone in sight. And the weapon was never used on the Play Putty. But that was ages ago, thought the player. There was no way that thing would still be roaming around. After devouring everyone, there was no longer a protein source. And without a protein source, it would lay dormant. So whilst the player roams around this slime-covered area, they finally locate the exit. But the bad news is that it's completely covered by the putty. There was no way they would get through that door. And after what the Play Putty did to all the workers, they didn't want to get any of that stuff on them. So they set out to find this so-called rumoured weapon that could combat the putty. As they search high and low, they find where this weapon would have been. But unfortunately, it was gone. What were they going to do now? But luckily they turn around and see exactly where it was. But unluckily, it was lodged in a large glob of Play Putty. Look at the size of this thing. The player just needs to quickly grab the weapon with the GrabPack and then they can attach it. As they approach the glob of putty, it squeals and slides away. Did that thing just make a sound? And did it have a mouth? Regardless, they had to chase this thing down and get that weapon. So the player would need to get close enough to grab the weapon out of the putty. The putty was surprisingly quick. They would evade the player quite easily. The player would need to keep chasing them down in order to grab the weapon. Eventually, the glob of putty would outrun the player and run into a large clearing. They then fuse themselves into an even larger glob of Play Putty. The player looks up and gets a better look at the monstrosity that's in front of them. Look at this thing, it was enormous! And the player soon realises why it was still alive today. It was slowly digesting all the other characters. They must have all been in there for quite some time. All of their bodies must have been giving this thing nutrients the whole time. The player needs to be extra careful and quietly sneak over to this large Play Putty blob. The player would need to carefully pull out the weapon from its body, and once they did, they would then attach it to their GrabPack and use it at their will. The weapon finally gets free and the player equips it. But as soon as they do, the giant glob of Play Putty wakes up. They see the player and immediately charge after them. They haven't slowly digested a human in years, and the player was definitely a treat that the Play Putty couldn't pass up. Just as the Play Putty gets close enough, the player uses the new weapon. A gust of freezing cold vapour shoots from out the end. For a moment, the Play Putty freezes in place. But then shortly after, it thaws and continues chasing. So that's how they kept this thing at bay. It was a freezing weapon. But this blob of Play Putty was far too large to freeze. But at least they could keep it at bay. So here and there, they would need to turn around and freeze the Play Putty while it was chasing them. This weapon might not be enough to completely freeze them, but it was definitely enough to freeze the putty that was covering the exit door. So the player needs to make their way over to the exit without getting consumed by the giant Play Putty. After running through all the halls and evading the putty, they finally make it to the exit. But the only thing is, they wouldn't have enough time to freeze it and make an escape with the Play Putty on their tail. So there's only one thing to do. The player needs to take the Play Putty head on if they were going to escape this place. So they noticed that the only thing keeping the putty moving was the multiple body parts stuck in its body. They were feeding off them and getting the nutrients. But a glob of putty this size would need a constant supply of food. The minute this thing doesn't have anything left to eat, it'll stop moving on the spot. So in this gameplay segment, the player has to temporarily freeze the Play Putty and remove each body part one at a time. This process would take some time, but they would eventually get them all out of the moving blob. Finally, the player was down to the last body part. They freeze the Play Putty a final time and extract the last piece. The moment that they do, the Play Putty collapses into a large puddle of goo. Finally, the player has defeated the Play Putty. The creature just lays there on the ground. The only thing that could possibly bring them back to life would be if some poor soul accidentally steps into the goo. But with this place being abandoned, that wouldn't happen anytime soon. So now it's time to freeze the putty covering the door. The player freezes it solid and strikes it with their grab hand. It shatters into pieces and the door is finally free. The player exits this area and prepares themselves for whatever they'll face next. Alrighty everyone, well that's all we have for today's video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider leaving a like, commenting and subscribing, as it helps out a lot and it's greatly appreciated. As always, let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of Play Putty and what you'd like to see going forward. Alrighty everyone, well, to the next video, catch you later, bye.